Today, we're in the Northwoods and headed up to the highest point of the Badger State. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're in the Northwoods and headed up to the highest point in Wisconsin. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located at the town of Hill in Price County, Timms Hill is part of the Northern Highlands, a physical geographical region that covers about the northern third of Wisconsin. It's part of the much larger Canadian Shield, an ancient geological construct dating back over 2.5 billion years ago that forms the heart of the North American continent. As you venture through the Northern Highlands, you are going to find a land of rolling hills, lakes, and forests. But this wasn't always the case. At one point, this was the home of mountains, massive peaks that rivaled the Rockies in the American West. So you have to wonder, what happened here to so drastically change the landscape? There are two major erosive forces on Earth, wind and water, and it was the latter that did most of the heavy lifting in this part of Wisconsin, in the form of massive walls of ice in what is popularly known as the Ice Age. But what exactly is an ice age? Well, in our daily parlance, we tend to use it to refer to the last period of glaciation. But perhaps a better definition is an ice age is a very long period of time with repeating cycles of glacial advancement and retreat. Geologists have identified 5 major ice ages that have affected Earth over its lifespan. Some of these have been quite severe, such as the theorized second snowball Earth dating back 700 million years ago, when the planet looked more like the planet Hoth from Star Wars. The ice age we're interested in is the most recent, the Quaternary or Pleistocene glaciation. This one started about 2.5 million years ago, and during its lifespan, there have been 4 major glacial advancements. And the most recent of those is the Wisconsin glaciation, which started about 100,000 years ago. It's hard for us to imagine just how massive these ice sheets were. Any glacier you could see today pales in comparison to these frozen monsters. They could reach up to 2.5 miles in height. That's over 13,000 feet. They were so heavy, they depressed the Earth's crust. So much water was contained in them, they actually lowered the ocean levels by several hundred feet. At their greatest extent, they covered about 1/4 of the Earth's landmass. The last glacier began its northern exodus from Wisconsin about 11,000 years ago. But they left their marks all around the landscape. The lobes of ice bulldozing and shaping it into its current form. Wisconsin itself is a great case study on the power of a glacier. And you can see it in the kettles, the moraines, the drumlins, the kames, the eskers, all these reminders of the power of Earth's great bulldozers. The ancient mountains here were graded down into this smoothed over landscape that we see around us. This is what's known as a peneplain, a region worn down nearly to a plain where formerly there was rougher topography. Timms Hill is very much part of this glacial history. Basically, all it is an accumulation of rocks and sediment that was deposited by the glaciers as they retreated. And that makes this place rather young, at least geologically speaking, especially when you compare it to the other state high points in the country, being formed only about 20,000 years ago. If you're seeking a longer adventure, there is a spur trail starting at Timms Hill that'll connect you to the longer Ice Age Trail, a 1,200-mile national scenic trail that winds across Wisconsin, following the terminal moraine of the last ice age. As the glaciers retreated, humans would start migrating to Wisconsin, and they'd arrive around here about 10,000 BCE, hunting big game in the form of mammoths, mastodon, and bison. Over the next 10 millennia, numerous cultures would rise and fall in Wisconsin, to include archaic, woodland, Mississippian, and Oneota. Remnants of these peoples can be found in the way of archaeological sites, effigy mounds, and village complexes. One of the best examples of the latter is the Aztalan site in the southern part of the state. These cultures and societies varied in diversity and complexity, some relying on hunting and gathering, others on fishing or farming or rudimentary mining of copper, or some building interconnected trade networks. Regardless, by the 1600s, changes were afoot throughout the North American continent. By the 17th century, Wisconsin was a land of many native peoples. There were the earlier Wisconsin tribes, such as the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Dakota, all theorized to have descended from the Oneota culture. They were joined by tribes coming from the east, such as the Sauk, Meskwaki, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, just to name a few, all displaced from their lands by conflicts, particularly the Iroquois Wars, which in turn had been spurred on by European colonization and an insatiable demand for fur. That drive for fur and trade would soon bring Europeans to the shores of Wisconsin, and the first to arrive were the French, led by a man named Jean Nicolet, a coureur de bois. That's French for a woodrunner, basically men who would venture into uncharted territory seeking to establish trade for fur. Legend has it that Nicolet arrived in 1634 near Green Bay on a quest to find that fabled route to the South Sea. That is debatable. More likely, he was here as an emissary to secure treaties and trade for French interests. After Nicolet, other French explorers, traders, and missionaries would arrive. But the French were pretty content to keep a light footprint in this area. They never did much in the way of infrastructure other than building a couple trading posts, one at Green Bay on the shores of Lake Michigan, and the other at modern-day Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi River. The British would take claim to this region in 1763 after defeating the French in the 7 Years' War, what we in the U.S. refer to as the French and Indian War. But other than enhancing the fort at Green Bay, they too were more interested in maintaining reliable and profitable trading relationships with the native peoples. In 1783, Great Britain would cede this land to the United States with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. It had become known as the Northwest Territory, and it was the United States' wild western frontier, at least for the first few years of the new country's existence. As the United States began to expand to the west, the Northwest Territory began to be chopped up into the Midwestern states we find today. The Wisconsin Territory would be established in 1836, and in the beginning it was significantly larger, including elements from the Louisiana Purchase, its western border running along the Missouri River. The high point for this territory would have been found in modern-day Burke County, North Dakota.
There is a misconception that the Upper Peninsula of Michigan should have actually been part of Wisconsin, but that was never the case. By the time the Wisconsin Territory was established, the border between the Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin had already been set. But it is true that the Badger State missed out on a higher state high point.
The large version of the Wisconsin Territory didn't exist for long. It'd be downsized only 2 years later, in 1838, when the western section, basically everything west of the Mississippi River, was established as the Iowa Territory. Once this happened, the highest point in the territory shifted back to the original Northwest Territory high point of Eagle Mountain, in what is now Minnesota.
Wisconsin's claim to Eagle Mountain, well, it would never make it through to statehood. Congress determined that the Badger State's future western neighbor would need access to Lake Superior. And so all that land west of the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers, well, that was transferred to the newly established Minnesota Territory. Wisconsin would become the 30th state in 1848. It would be the last whole state carved from the Northwest Territory, land that the United States had acquired at the conclusion of the American Revolution. A visit to this region of Wisconsin is going to immerse you into one of the other defining features of the state, the Northwoods. The Northwoods is a massive boreal forest that runs from Maine out east all the way into Minnesota in the west, and then here in Wisconsin stretching north into Canada. This land of lakes, rivers, and forests is an amazing sight to see today, but it is vastly different than it was 200 years ago when pioneers first started to arrive in Wisconsin.
Originally, this was a land of conifer trees, particularly giant hemlocks and towering white pines. These forests were especially thick in the Michigan Peninsula and the upper 2/3 of Wisconsin. It was said a squirrel could run from one side of the Northwoods to the other without ever touching ground. The most valued of these trees were the stands of eastern white pines. These trees had long been prized for their wood, even back to colonial days. Wisconsin had them in abundance. But despite the plentiful stands, in the early days, the timber industry was small-scale and local. This changed drastically by the latter half of the 19th century.
As the United States expanded to the west, the demand for lumber had increased. The early timber stands that had fueled the development of the colonies and states out east had been exhausted, and new areas were needed to feed the voracious appetites of developing cities like Chicago and St. Louis. And Wisconsin looked to have an inexhaustible supply of trees.
In addition to the seemingly inexhaustible supply of trees, Wisconsin had, courtesy of the glaciers, an interconnected web of rivers and lakes. These made transportation of timber easier. The Wisconsin River providing a natural water highway to markets in St. Louis, and Lake Michigan access to Chicago. In addition to this were the benefits of Wisconsin's long winters. The cold, snowy season made it easier to skid logs out of the woods, and at times, even down the frozen rivers. By the late 19th century, logging in Wisconsin had become a booming business, brought on by the arrival of the railroad. No longer were logging enterprises shackled to waterways. The railway allowed for logging in forests that were previously cost prohibitive. With better access, the timber industry shifted into high gear.
The amount of wood that would come out of these forests is absolutely mind-boggling. It was estimated they'd produce 130 billion board feet of high-grade pine. A board foot being a unit of measurement that's 1 foot in length, 1 foot in width, and 1 inch in thickness. This was just for the high-grade pine. This doesn't take in the factors of the other woods, like the cedars or hemlocks or the various hardwoods. When you add those numbers on, it becomes absolutely astronomical.
In the Black River Valley in the western part of the state alone, enough pine was harvested to build a boardwalk 9 feet wide and 4 inches thick that would have encircled the entire world. Logging had become, and still is, an integral part of Wisconsin industry and its culture.
You can still find remnants of the logging boom scattered across the Northwoods. Drive around for a little bit and you're guaranteed to run into references of Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox, or find relics of that time used by the mills and lumberjacks. But for my money, there is one artifact about an hour away from the high point that really drives home the scale of it all.
Here in the city of Cornell, you will find an amazing machine, one of, if not the only, remaining pulpwood stacker in the world. This 175-foot monstrosity still rises up above over the community. While this man-made machine serves as a good representation of the march of progress, there was a dark side to all this cutting as well. All this cutting and clearing was not without consequence, some severe and devastating. There was no thought given to sustainable forestry, or even something as basic as replanting trees. Lumber companies stripped the land and moved on, leaving it barren and prone to erosion and fires. Farmers coming in behind them used slash and burn techniques to clear the land. The piles of refuse left behind were perfect tinderboxes, just waiting for a spark. On October 8th, 1871, these consequences would turn deadly. The city of Peshtigo lies on the Peshtigo River, north of Green Bay. At the time, it was a thriving community with about 2,000 residents. Its success was tied tightly to the logging industry, home to the largest woodenware factory and one of the largest sawmills in the world at that time. The summer had been historically hot and dry. Rivers were shallow. That led to cut timber being stacked on the banks, waiting for rain so they could be floated down to Green Bay. Peshtigo itself was a fire marshal's nightmare. Due to the plentiful nature of wood, it was used for everything: houses, sidewalks, bridges, wood stacked up for production and to burn for heat. Sawdust was even used on the streets to keep down the mud and dust.
On top of this, a massive low-pressure system was moving into the area, creating windy conditions. The environment was set for a catastrophe of epic proportions. The fire itself had actually started 2 weeks prior, out in the woods to the west. But because of these gusting winds, it was now being driven towards the town.
On the evening of October 8th, there was an ominous red glow on the horizon, the air filled with smoke and a sound like a low rumble of thunder in the distance. At 10 p.m., as people were sleeping in their beds, that rumble turned into a roar as the gates of hell opened.
A wall of flames literally blasted out of the forest and engulfed everything in its path. The high winds had whipped the flames into a firestorm, with temperatures reaching up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn sand into glass. Terror and chaos ensued.
People and animals tried to flee, but the strong winds blew them to the ground, the dust and smoke blinding them, the hot air charring people's lungs, and the flames setting hair and clothes on fire. Those that reached the river and plunged in found little in the way of relief, the flames racing over the top, and the cold water subjecting people to hypothermia.
The fire obliterated Peshtigo. Within an hour, the entire town was destroyed, with only the Church of St. Mary's surviving the inferno. 800 people died in Peshtigo alone, with hundreds more dying in the woods surrounding the town. Many burnt beyond recognition.
Over 1.2 million acres were burned, and dozens of other smaller communities in the area were also destroyed. It's been estimated that at least 1,200 people were killed, though there are some estimates ranging twice that number. It is the deadliest wildfire in American history. Despite the severity and size of the Peshtigo fire, it has remained relatively unknown, because, in an unfortunate historical coincidence, it occurred on the same night as another inferno was burning at the southern end of Lake Michigan, the Great Chicago Fire.
To compound the tragedy of the Peshtigo fire, nothing would really change with logging practices. Many of the types and techniques that had been used to exacerbate the severity of the fire would continue to be used, and wildfires would plague the Northwoods for decades to come.
In the end, the trees would not be inexhaustible, and by the early 1900s, the timber companies would move on to other places in the U.S. The logging boom of the late 19th century would leave northern Wisconsin scarred and in ruin, and it would take decades to recover.
To put this in a bit of perspective, when lumberjacks would arrive here, about 80% of Wisconsin was covered in old-growth forest. And these were trees that were centuries old and reached up in height of 200 feet or more. Almost all of that would be erased. Today, in Wisconsin, about 0.5% of the land is old-growth forest.
There are a few places in the state where you can catch a glimpse of what these ancient woods would have been like before the axe and saw. One of the best can be found at Cathedral Pines, a few hours' drive to the east of Timms Hill.
The Cathedral Pines is one of the finest old-growth examples in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. 1, 2, 3. The Cathedral Pines is one of the best examples of an old-growth forest in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. If you get a chance to walk through them, you'll catch a glimpse of what Wisconsin used to look like, and see sort of what was lost. We can thank a woman named Lucy Rumsey Holt for that forest's existence. She used to bring her children there, and they enjoyed playing amongst the tall, towering pines. She was able to convince her husband, William Holt, who just so happened to own the forest and be the owner of the Holt Lumber Company, to leave them intact.
There are also a few closer to Timms Hill. Germain and Holmboe are both to the northeast, and would be easy stops on the way if you opt to bag the Michigan State High Point as well.
Now it's time to take a closer look at Timms Hill itself.
It was the railroad that put Ogama on the map, literally. The town got its start as Station 89 for the Wisconsin Central Railroad. Not long after it was established, settlers started to arrive, the first in the early 1870s. More would soon follow to support the railroad and others to start logging.
One of those early arrivals was a Swedish Baptist minister with the last name Ostergen. He would move in and build a log cabin and garden on top of the hill. And soon this place was known as Ostergens Kull, kull being a Swedish word meaning hilltop. In addition to his ministry, Ostergen was also an emigrant agent for the railroad and would be responsible for more than a few Swedish families moving to this area.
By the turn of the century, Ogama was a thriving railroad town with a post office, stores, churches, a school, and taverns. Population was growing as more families moved to the area.
Ostergens Kull would have a new owner as well. In the 1880s, a man named Timothy Gahan would come here, brought by the booming timber industry. He'd establish a logging camp on Timms Lake, the body of water right north of the hill. Not much is known about Gahan other than the fact that he had a predilection to name features of his property after himself and that he would eventually move on. As for logging, Timms Hill would last be cut in the 1940s.
Despite all this activity, Wisconsin's real high point remained unknown. After all, this isn't really a state known for elevation, and Timms Hill doesn't really jump out at you. It blends right in, covered in woods and surrounded by other hills similar in nature and height. Even today, Timms Hill keeps a pretty low-key reputation. If you were to ask Wisconsinites what their state high point is, you may get a few different answers. Some may point to a location in the southern part of the state at West Blue Mound. This peak definitely makes a statement, rising up to 1,719 feet, easily visible above the surrounding driftless area. While it is the tallest peak in the southern part of the state, it's only the 15th highest county high point and the 22nd highest peak overall. But there is one area where it truly stands above the competition. West Blue Mound has a prominence of 932 feet, making it the most prominent peak in the Badger State.
Another answer you may get is for a peak in the north central part of the state near the city of Wausau, Rib Mountain. It definitely looks the part of a state high point, a massive block of granite that rises up over the city to an elevation of 1,924 feet. It's easily visible from miles around.
For quite a long time, Rib Mountain was thought to be the state high point. In fact, if you go to the summit of the peak today, you'll find a remnant of that time. There's an old plaque up there which boldly proclaims its title of Wisconsin's highest point.
Tucked away here in the Northwoods, Timms Hill didn't even have an official name, still operating under the unofficial name given to it by Gahan. Not only that, when this area finally received its first fire tower, it was built on nearby Ring Hill, because that was actually thought to be the taller peak. Fortunately for Timms Hill, it had a champion in the form of a local county surveyor named Leonard Reisberg.
Rib Mountain's claim as the state high point never quite sat right with Reisberg, and he set out to prove it false. He'd been born near Timms Hill and later became the county surveyor of Price County. Reisberg would put the wheels in motion to resurvey this area, and along with efforts from the state, determine that Timms Hill was the actual official highest point in Wisconsin.
It would take years for Reisberg's efforts to bear fruit, but eventually they would. In 1966, this peak was listed in Wisconsin's Blue Book as the high point. Then in 1975, after a detailed land survey of this area, Timms Hill was officially bestowed the title of State High Point. In 1978, the land would be sold to Price County. who would turn it into a park, whose doors would open to the general public in 1983.
While Timms Hill was designated the highest point in the state, it still isn't without some controversy. It only retains the title by a mere 8 inches over its neighbor peak, Pearson Hill, about a half-mile away to the east. And there are folks in the area that would argue that Pearson is, in fact, the taller peak.
Timms Hill may not be the most glamorous of state high points, and it is definitely not the most challenging, but it does have a few things going for it that set it apart from its peers. And one of those is its location. Timms Hill is the closest state high point to a geographical curiosity that's based on how we locate ourselves on planet Earth. And if you're going to stop in and visit Timms Hill, well, you may also wish to stop in and take in this place as well.
Near Poniatowski, Wisconsin, you'll find the center of the northwestern world at 45 degrees north latitude and 90 degrees west longitude. It's tucked away in a small county park bordered by woods and fields.
Standing in this location right here puts you in the exact center of the Northwest Hemisphere. You are halfway from the equator to the North Pole and halfway between the prime meridian and the international dateline. There's only 4 of these points in the world, and this one right here in Marathon County, Wisconsin, is the easiest to get to.
The 2 in the southern hemisphere are located in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the latter being the antipode of this one. The other northern one, in the eastern hemisphere, is located in a remote area in western China, which, for the interest of high pointers, does sit at the highest elevation of 3,311 feet.
If you do decide to stop in and visit this location, you can become official members of the 4590 Club. But to do that, you're going to have to make one more stop to the Wausau Convention and Visitors Bureau. There you'll be able to sign the official logbook, and you'll receive a metal token commemorating your visit to the center of the northwestern world. Another quirk about this place is who actually owns and operates it. Now, most state high points are either federal, state, or privately held lands. But in the case of Timms Hill, it's one of only 2 state high points that's owned and operated by a county. If you're wondering what the other is, well, you'll find it in Iowa at Hawkeye Point.
Then there is the name of the place itself. While quite a few state high points are named after people, this place is one of only 2 state high points that use the first name of a former owner in their nomenclature, the other being Rhode Island's Jerimoth Hill, named after Jerimoth Brown.
Another thing about this place is the name, Tim with 2 M's, instead of Tim with 1, the usual shortened version of Timothy. Or why this place wasn't called Gahan Hill using the last name. Or why didn't it revert back to its original name of Ostrigan's Cool? Well, the answer for all those questions fell on one man, Roy Meyer, a Price County board member and local historian.
When this place became the official state high point, it was still being called by the name Gahan had given it over 80 years before, except it only had 1 M. That name stuck, but Meyer decided to add the extra M because he thought it made the hill's name look a bit more prestigious.
In a bit of a side note, nearby Timms Lake would carry on with 1 M, but over the decades since, it too has now gained the 2nd M, just like the hill. As far as Ostrigan's Cool goes, though, Meyer didn't discover the original name until it was too late. And despite a push to change it to what I think was the more interesting name, it never gained much in the way of traction. So this place remains Tim's Hill.
There is one more thing about the name Tim's Hill, this bit about the latter half of it. It's a high point that knows exactly what it is. It doesn't have some designs to be something greater by calling itself a mountain or a peak. With that in mind, it is the tallest landform that calls itself a hill on the 50-state high point list. Timms Hill County Park is located 7 miles east of Ogama. Before or after your visit, you may wish to stop in to the Hill of Beans, located on the south side of Bass Lake. Once you enter the park, you'll drive a short distance down a one-way paved road until you reach an open parking area.
Of all the 50-state high points, this one has some personal significance to me. It's the first state high point I ever summited. I grew up about 30 miles to the south of here, and so I came up here several times as a kid. In addition to that, every time I get back to Wisconsin, I try to visit it, which makes it my most visited state high point. But enough about that. It's just a short hike to the top. Let's go check it out.
It doesn't take much effort to get to the top. The trail leading to the summit is less than a quarter of a mile, and it is well established and easy to follow. If you are looking for longer hikes, the park does have several other trails as well.
When you do get to the top of Timms Hill, you'll see that there isn't much in the way of views. But you can get a great view of the surrounding area. You just need to go a little higher, up that observation tower behind me. Let's go check it out.
The wooden observation tower is also easy to ascend, and with a decent-sized viewing platform at the top, it provides excellent views in almost all directions.
When you get to the top of the tower and you take in the view, you can really get a sense of the magnitude of the Northwoods. In some ways, I've always felt it's like being Bilbo Baggins climbing to the top of the tree in Mirkwood in The Hobbit. The forest stretching out as far as the eye can see. And that's actually a fairly apt comparison, because the Northwoods of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are just a tad bit smaller than Tolkien's great forest of Mirkwood.
While there are signs on the wooden tower noting the elevation, if you are looking for the actual benchmark, you'll find it under the adjacent fire tower on the top of a concrete pillar.
And here we are on the summit of Timms Hill, the rooftop of Wisconsin. With an elevation of 1,951.5 feet, this is the 39th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment and click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.